Nick was a handsome billionaire who adored his wife Jane and treated her mother, Ada, with the utmost generosity. He made sure Ada had everything she could ever need: lavish vacations, endless shopping sprees, a beautiful house, and a luxury car. He never hesitated to ensure her comfort. But did Ada, his mother-in-law, truly care about him? Let's find out in this gripping, dramatic tale. And please subscribe and give a thumbs up to the video. One evening, Nick came home from work feeling unwell. His stomach churned painfully, and a fever had started creeping in. His vision blurred as he stumbled into the house, calling out for someone, anyone, to assist him. Jane was out of town with their housekeeper, leaving only Ada in the house. Feeling weak, Nick called out to her, "Ada, could you please bring me a glass of water?" His voice was hoarse, his throat parched. Ada didn't even look up from her phone. "You should have hired more housekeepers. Then you wouldn't be in this situation." Nick blinked, barely believing what he heard. He groaned as another wave of nausea hit him. "Just a glass of water, please." Ada sighed dramatically, as if the mere request inconvenienced her. She stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't want to help. She returned 10 minutes later and placed the water on the table across the room, far from Nick's reach. Nick tried to muster the strength to get up. His hands trembled, his legs wobbled, and as he reached for the glass, he knocked it over, spilling the water. He gasped, his breath short, his body weak. Ada rolled her eyes. "Well, that's your problem now." Without another word, she returned to her phone, scrolling mindlessly. Nick barely had time to react before another wave of sickness overtook him. He vomited into a nearby bin, his body convulsing from dehydration. Ada wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Disgusting," she muttered and walked out, leaving Nick alone, vulnerable and barely able to move. For 2 days, Nick remained sick, growing more dehydrated by the hour. Ada refused to help. Instead, she ordered food for herself, eating lavish meals while Nick lay weak and miserable in the next room. When Nick's best friend, Joe, came to visit, he was appalled by what he saw. "Nick, you look terrible," Joe gasped, rushing to his side. "Have you been drinking water? Eating anything?" Nick shook his head weakly. "I've tried, but I can't keep anything down." Joe turned to Ada, who was still sitting nearby, her eyes glued to her phone. "You've been here all this time. Why haven't you helped him?" Ada barely glanced up. "I'm not his nurse," she replied dismissively. "He's a grown man. He should take care of himself." Joe's face darkened with anger. "After everything he's done for you, he bought you a house, a car, he gave you everything, and you won't even give him a glass of water." Ada shrugged. "He should have planned better." Joe's hands balled into fists, but he took a deep breath. He knelt beside Nick and helped him drink some water. "This is unbelievable," Joe muttered. "Nick, that woman does not care about you. Imagine how she would treat you if you didn't have money." Nick sighed. "Joe, you're exaggerating. She wouldn't treat me like a pauper." Joe looked at him, eyes serious. "Do you want to bet on that?" Nick hesitated. A part of him didn't want to believe it, but deep down, a sliver of doubt crept into his mind. He exhaled heavily. "All right, let's do it." Nick and Joe spent the next day carefully crafting the perfect scheme. Nick called his financial team and instructed them to freeze all visible assets temporarily. His luxury cars were sent away for repossession. His company credit cards were deactivated, and foreclosure notices were discreetly placed on his properties. The day Jane returned from her trip, she walked into chaos. The staff was gone, the house was nearly empty, and Nick sat on the couch with his head in his hands. "Jane, I lost everything," he said solemnly. "The company, the house, the cars, the banks are taking everything." Jane gasped, covering her mouth. "No, how did this happen?" Nick held her hands. "We need to stay with your mom for a little while." Jane hesitated, but nodded. "Okay, let's ask her." That evening, they approached Ada, who was sipping tea in the living room. "Mom," Jane started, "we need a place to stay for a few weeks." Ada's face twitched. "Stay here? You know I like my house kept in a certain way." "It's only for a short time," Jane pleaded. "Please." Ada sighed dramatically. "You can stay, Jane. But Nick, he should find another place." Nick's mouth dropped open. "Are you serious?" "It was a gift," Ada scoffed. "I earned this house for raising a beautiful daughter." Nick swallowed his anger. He moved in, determined to see how far Ada's cruelty would go. Nick went out pretending to search for a job during the day, but secretly meeting with Joe to know the status of things in his company, and returned home to Ada's taunts. "Stop lounging around like a lazy man. Go get a job," Ada sneered. One afternoon, Ada stormed into the guest room, where Nick was napping, and dumped a bowl of water on him. "Wake up and stop being useless," she shouted. Nick sat up, his body shaking with anger. "What is wrong with you?" Ada laughed mockingly. "I don't want a broke man in my house." Jane tried to reason with her mother, but Ada silenced her. "I won't accept a poor son-in-law. He needs to get back on his feet." One day, Ada gave Nick an ultimatum. "If you want to stay here, you'll work for me. Clean my house and my store." Nick endured the humiliation, determined to finish the test. Meanwhile, he met secretly with Joe, who was still managing his businesses. "This has gone far enough," Nick said. "I'm done. I'm taking back my life." That evening, when Nick returned, he found the door locked. Ada emerged, a bucket of water in hand. She dumped it on him and sneered, "Take your broke self somewhere else." Jane wanted to leave with Nick, but hesitated. She obeyed her mother, staying behind as Nick walked away. Dear amazing viewers, I know that you are thinking that Nick has had enough of Ada's maltreatment and is finally ready to reclaim his life. Is he? Please keep watching to find out. Before I continue, I would like to ask you to kindly subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Please click on the subscribe button. Much appreciation. And if you are a returning subscriber, welcome back and thank you so much. Now, back to the story. The next day, Nick stood outside Ada's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come to take Jane home, to make her understand that everything had been a test. He had never truly lost his wealth, and now it was time to reveal the truth. But as he approached the door, he saw a well-dressed man stepping out. The stranger adjusted his expensive cufflinks before walking past Nick with a smug grin. Nick's stomach tightened. Something felt off. He knocked on the door, and after a long moment, Ada answered. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a triumphant smile on her face. "Oh, look who's here," she said, with mock surprise. Nick pushed past her and stepped inside. "Where is Jane?" he demanded. Ada laughed, a slow, mocking chuckle. "Why? You think she's been waiting around for you? A broke man?" She clicked her tongue and shook her head. "She's moving on. There's a new suitor, and he's rich." Nick's fists clenched at his sides. His breath came in short, controlled bursts. "She's still my wife," he said, his voice low but firm. Ada smirked, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Not for long," she said, folding her arms. "Unlike you, this man can take care of her. He has wealth, class, and stability. Everything you lost." Nick's jaw tightened. He had expected Ada to be heartless, but he never thought Jane would let another man into her life so quickly. "Does she know the truth?" he asked. "The truth?" Ada scoffed. "The truth is, you're nothing now, and I told her she deserves better." Nick felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had given Ada everything: her house, her car, her lavish lifestyle. And now, when she thought he had nothing, she had turned against him completely. But she had no idea that he still controlled everything. He took a step closer, looking Ada dead in the eyes. "You think money makes a man?" he asked. "You think Jane can be bought?" Ada lifted her chin. "She won't stay with a man who has nothing." Nick exhaled, nodding slowly. "All right," he said, backing away toward the door. "If that's how you want to play this." Ada laughed again. "It's not a game, Nick. It's just reality." Nick turned and walked out, his mind racing. He had hoped to take Jane back peacefully, to explain everything. But now, he had no choice. He would take action. And when he did, Ada and Jane would learn a painful lesson. Nick climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel. "You wanted money?" he muttered. "Let's see how you live without it." That night, Nick made the call. Every asset he had gifted Ada, the house, the car, the luxury lifestyle, was legally still under his company's name. By the next morning, everything she owned would be gone. Ada had chosen money over loyalty. Now, she would have neither. The next morning, Nick arrived at his company headquarters, greeted by his loyal employees who were unaware of his test. Joe grinned. "Welcome back, boss. Everything is intact." Nick smiled. Time to set things right. Within days, all of Nick's assets were unfrozen. He moved back into his mansion, reclaiming every gift he had given Ada: her house, car, and grocery store. The shock on Ada's face was priceless when company officials arrived to evict her. "No, you can't do this," Ada cried, realizing everything was legally owned by Nick's company. Nick stood firm. "I gave you everything, and you discarded me the moment you thought I had nothing. Now, you can return to the life you had before." Jane, in tears, fell to her knees. "Nick, I was manipulated by my mother. Please forgive me." Nick took a deep breath. "I forgive you, Jane. But trust, once broken, is not easily restored." Ada, sobbing, watched as movers took away her belongings. "Please, Nick, I was wrong." Nick sighed. "Ada, I don't wish you ill, but you need to learn a lesson about loyalty and gratitude. I hope this serves as a wake-up call." Jane vowed never to betray Nick's trust again, determined to prove her love. And as Ada walked away, humbled and broken, Nick knew one thing for sure: true character is revealed when everything is stripped away. And Ada had failed the test. The dust had barely settled on Ada's downfall. Nick had reclaimed everything, and she had been forced to return to the simple life she had before. Meanwhile, Jane struggled to repair her relationship with Nick, but trust, once broken, was not so easily restored. Days turned into weeks, and Jane constantly tried to reach out to Nick. She sent messages, left voicemails, and even showed up at his mansion unannounced. Each time, she was met with silence or rejection, but she wasn't ready to give up just yet. One evening, as Nick sat in his grand office, staring out at the city skyline, his phone buzzed. It was Jane. Again. This time, He hesitated before answering. "Nick, please." Jane's voice trembled. "Let me see you. Just once." Nick sighed. A part of him still loved her, but the betrayal still stung. Against his better judgment, he agreed. "Meet me tomorrow at the park, 5 p.m. No more, no less." The next day, Jane arrived early. She wore a modest dress, her face devoid of the lavish makeup she once indulged in. She looked like the woman he had fallen in love with before the wealth had consumed her. When Nick arrived, he stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "You have 5 minutes." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "Nick, I made a mistake. I let my mother manipulate me. I should have stood by you. I know that now." Nick tilted his head slightly. "And why should I believe you? You replaced me the moment you thought I had nothing." Jane shook her head, stepping closer. "I was scared. I thought I'd lose everything. And my mother, she convinced me that I needed security. I was wrong." Nick studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Words mean nothing, Jane. Prove it." She wiped her tears. "How?" Nick's gaze was cold. "Cut Ada out of your life. Walk away from her influence. Start from scratch. Show me that you've truly changed." Jane hesitated. "She's still my mother." Nick scoffed. "Then nothing has changed?" He turned to leave. "No, wait." Jane grabbed his arm. "I'll do it." Nick searched her face for any sign of deception. "I don't want promises. I want action." Jane nodded firmly. "Then watch me." Meanwhile, Ada's fall from grace was harder than she had expected. The friends she once dined with at luxury restaurants had abandoned her. The credit cards Nick had paid for were cancelled. She now lived in a modest apartment, struggling to adjust to her new reality. One evening, as she sat alone in her tiny living room, sipping cheap tea, there was a knock on the door. When she opened it, she was shocked to see Jane standing there. "Mom," Jane said quietly, stepping inside. Ada straightened her back. "Jane, oh thank goodness. I knew you wouldn't abandon me." Jane took a deep breath. "I'm here to tell you that I'm cutting ties." Ada's face paled. "What?" "I love you, Mom, but I won't let you manipulate me anymore. You made me turn my back on my husband. You encouraged me to be greedy. And I lost everything because of it." Ada's lips quivered. "Jane, don't be foolish. You're all I have left." Jane's eyes were filled with resolve. "You never cared about me. You only cared about what I could gain. And I won't be that person anymore." With that, Jane turned and walked away, leaving Ada standing in the doorway, realizing for the first time that she had lost everything. Weeks passed, and Jane rebuilt her life. She found a job, moved into a small apartment, and slowly earned Nick's trust back. It wasn't easy, but each step she took, she did it with sincerity. She was ready to move on to a new phase in her life, and most importantly, she wanted to show Nick that she values him, and she was ready to build a real relationship based on trust and not material things. One evening, Nick visited her apartment. He stood at her doorstep, hands in his pockets. "You really did it." Jane nodded. "I had to, for myself, not just for you." A small smile tugged at Nick's lips. "Maybe we should start over." Jane's eyes lit up with hope. "I'd love that." And so, they began again, not as billionaire and wife, but as two people willing to rebuild what was lost, this time with loyalty and love as their foundation. Before you watch the next video, kindly subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed yet, please click on the subscribe button and like this video. Be a part of my channel's growth by clicking on the next video on the screen and drop a comment to let me know what you think about the story. Thank you for watching. Much appreciation.